Hello, good morning and afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today for this Brandwatch webinar, Thinking Outside the Bubble. We're going to be talking about how to build a valuable B2B audience. We'll be looking at social media in particular, but we'll also be thinking beyond that. My name is Nick, and I am the Product Marketing Manager at Brandwatch. I'm also the product marketing manager for the new audiences product which Brandwatch is releasing later on this year, which we'll be showing you a little bit of over this webinar. I'm joined today, very fortunate to be joined by Lauren Perkins, who is a brand marketer, community builder. She's the founder and CEO of Perks Consulting, which is a marketing advertisement firm. And she's the driving force behind that firm's approach, think like a brand, act like a startup. She's also founding instructor at General Assembly. She's entrepreneur in residence at the Columbia School of Business, and she is the author of the Community Manager's Playbook. And I'm also joined by Benj Pettit, who is the data scientist working on this audience's product. Benj's PhD was studying the collective behavior of flocking homing pigeons, and he's now bringing that expertise to studying human beings. We'll be talking a little bit about audiences. It's a really exciting new addition to the Brandwatch platform. It's currently in beta, so some of the stuff that you'll be looking at is examples of the technology behind it and a few sort of examples of how it's looking already. That product will be launching this summer. If you have any questions about that, do get in touch. So what we're going to talk about today, we are going to ask, what is my audience? A really important question, and especially an important one for a B2B business. Once we know what that is, how do we actually define a B2B audience? How do we understand who those people are? What do we do once we've found those people? Which are the most important people, and how important are influencers to our marketing? And what does success look like? Always a really important question to answer. Please, whilst we're running this webinar, don't be shy. We'd love to have your questions, your participation. You can ask those questions within the webinar, or you can tweet us at Brandwatch Tips. And also this webinar will be recorded and you will be able to download it later on. Our first question is, what is my audience? Lauren, I'm going to be asking you this question from the point of view of someone who wants to know, I suppose this word means lots and lots of different things to lots of different people. When we think about marketing, we might think of our audience as the people who we are interacting with, the people who are listening to us. But does this extend any further than that?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to dive into just the nuts and bolts of this. Audience is one of those things that I feel like is misunderstood today and often looked at way too narrowly. For me, audience and community have a lot of interplay, and audience really can feed building a community. Whether you already have one and you're trying to further cultivate it, or whether you're trying to build one up. And what I would sort of say in terms of how do you actually define audience is that we find that it's much bigger than just one customer profile or persona, and that often not only is audience much more complex, because we now can know, thanks to social media and social listening tools like Brandwatch, so much more about even just one individual. It's not just, in the B2B environment, what is their job title, and, what specifically are they responsible for procuring or buying from a business standpoint. But we know if they're into sports, if they're into arts, if they're, what they do in their spare time. And all of that context and that information just gives us such a richer picture and view of audience. And how we can engage with people. There's just so many more opportunities because of that increase in transparency and information.
Absolutely. So we're thinking about looking beyond people that are engaged with us then, people who are already within a circle that we understand. Ben, we pulled together a really simple but quite beautiful looking piece of data which is based on IBM's audience. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the smallest circle are the people who've engaged with IBM by retweeting or mentioning one of the IBM handles over the past year. And then you have the bigger green circle, who are the followers of any of those IBM handles. But that only scratches the surface of the possible target audience, people who have similar interests or professions to those engaged authors or to those followers.
And so how have you started to define that larger blue circle there?
So one of the key things is to look at an audience who we know are interested, like the followers or the engaged authors, and see how they differ to the rest of Twitter. So what are the key attributes in terms of how they describe themselves or who they interact with that sets them apart? And then that starts to give us some clues, like keywords and tags that we can start to use to build the target audience using this new tool.
So we're starting with an audience that we know is our real target audience, the people that are already engaged, and then we're essentially creating lookalikes of that, or we're kind of growing that out. We're finding similar people, and we're kind of building a larger network.
That's right, and with this product, starting with your followers will be a way to introduce you into the types of tags and search terms that we have available in the product.
So Lauren, my next question, I suppose, is we can see that there's this really, really huge potential out there. There's this large blue circle of people that haven't engaged with us yet, may not even know about our brand yet. And it's very easy to listen to people who are already talking about us, or listen to people who might be talking about something specific that we know to go out and track. But how do we define the people that we want to go out and reach? So Ben just talked about networks, but who are the people that we're really looking for?
Absolutely. So I think to build off of what Ben was just talking about in terms of even the IBM scenario, they have some context, and then what they're looking at in terms of what they already know about their audience is the place to start often, is what they can define based on who they're following and are interested in and who's interested in them. And then moving from that, really broadening that definition of audience and like what the community looks like and what they desire the community to look like. There's that opportunity to start to understand not only who the target is, but also the other audiences that they didn't know were engaged with them. And I think that it opens up that ability to define the target audience in multiple ways. Essentially what we're looking at is we're going beyond the job titles, we're going beyond just their basic interests. And I think one of the important concepts that I've been teaching a lot more in my work and seeing as well live with clients is that the idea of B2B to C is much more relevant. So from a B2B standpoint, it's not just what business is selling to what business. It goes beyond that in terms of that C being the customers, but also that customer could be the end customer. It could be the employees in the company, and really looking at who are all of the stakeholders and all of the potential audiences that are engaging. And that's one of the beauties of social listening is you can see who already is engaging, and if there's audiences that you believe should be, you can identify those audiences, see what they're talking about, see if there's ways of pulling them into that conversation. And I think that really allows for sort of being able to map multiple audience profiles. And the beauty of that is often because we're trying to sort of widen the net, that narrow profile is the starting point, but then when you do the social listening, you're able to see all of the different types of audiences that are playing in the existing community and those that are talking about the topic that you could potentially try to build a relationship with to pull them into the community that you're working in.
That's really interesting. So I think traditionally we might understand an audience as being something that is very much a B2C concept. But you're saying this really applies, even though a B2B isn't directly looking for millennials in Canada or tennis fans in Scotland. Actually, it's not just about the persona, it's about growing that audience and really understanding a network of people.
It is absolutely about understanding a network of people and all of the stakeholders that are participating, customers and employees being obviously two very important ones, but depending on the business, and IBM being a great example, the number of businesses and vendors that IBM has, they have such a larger persona mix than you would think about if you were just doing, kind of more thinking about through the more traditional marketing lens, which opens up just amazing opportunities to find places for competitive advantage. And as the market continues to move as fast as it is, and there's so much transparency and volume of information, being able to discover insights about specific target audience groups can add significant value to the business, from recruiting to product ideas to customer service, all the way through to business development and and direct sell-through potentially.
Yeah, so we're stuck with IBM for another piece of data that Benj is going to tell us a little bit about how this this beautiful chart kind of was put together.
Yeah, so this is a visualization of the main clusters in the interaction network of IBM followers. So we looked at how IBM followers were mentioning each other or retweeting each other, and then there are automatically some communities that cluster out of that. And the words, so each of these communities is a circle in the diagram, and it's labeled with words that come from our metadata tags, where we've classified the accounts, and also words that they use to describe themselves in their bios. And these are the words that statistically stand out as being occurring more often within that cluster. So two of them that I'd like to draw attention to are the green one in the bottom right has the words health, healthcare, medical, fitness. So this seems to be a group of people who we've identified just through their social interactions. They're interacting much more frequently with other people in the health and medical space. And then we have the light blue community towards the center with words like IBM, IBMer, and they're also concerned about how their opinions are received. Mm-hmm. This community seems to have a lot more of the employees. It's where the employees of IBM are concentrated. So
I suppose people who are strongly connected to those employees, so people within their networks as well.
Yeah, that's right. So anyone who mostly interacts with IBM employees and also follows IBM, so they might be a prospective employee or a past employee, they'll also be pulled into that network.
So Lauren, we look at something like this and we can see that actually when we talk about an audience, and it's a pretty simple starting point that Ben just talking about, in fact within that there's a lot more going on, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, audiences are so much more complex than we give sort of credit to, and I think that that's one of the big changes, especially in the last several years, when we have more channels and we have more topics that people are talking about, and a lot more cross-dialogue, which is more community-centric opposed to more push and pull-centric. There is a lot more complexity, and something like even this graphic that Ben just took us through really gives us a lot more clarity in terms of the context of different conversations and the clusters of what those types of conversations are, in order to be able to use that information not only in our content strategy, but there's so much we can learn to it that can be applied to community strategy, marketing strategy, and even oftentimes product and business strategy.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that I'd really take away from looking at this is that as a brand, I mean, this is a large brand that we're talking about, but I think that this gets reflected a lot in other audiences. There isn't one voice to talk to your audience in, right?
No, absolutely not. I mean, a lot of the most successful communities that I've seen and that I've worked with get very good at understanding the different nuances of the broader audiences and the sub-personas and the different details that can really make for much richer engagement. And if you look at a company like Adobe, one of the things that they've done really well is they've activated their employees to be a huge part of that conversation, which creates a lot stronger connectivity between employee and customer, and having that be direct conversation. Just one example of many brands out there that are using this level of complexity and volume of conversation to their advantage by empowering people that they're already paying their employees. Why not leverage them? And I think that that's one significant layer for B2B brands, especially, is how do you leverage that complexity in a way that allows you to better communicate with all of your stakeholders and rise essentially the whole tide up.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose you've started to tell me a little bit now about what do we do once we find these, and certainly with employees it totally makes sense to sort of unlock that potential. With these audiences in general, what do I need to find out now about these audiences, and what am I looking for that really makes this process worthwhile? We've seen that there are these different clusters. We've seen that there are these different networks and these different type of people. What am I trying to discover that I didn't know or I wasn't able to do before?
Well, I think that you've touched on a couple things there, Nick. The first thing is that active listening as a practice for a lot of businesses, especially in the B2B environment, and in the last 5 years of my career, I've been doing a lot more B2B, although I originally started more on the B2C side. And I have been seeing that there hasn't been a practice, especially with B2B companies, on average, of active listening, and I think that that's a really important starting point, because it starts to become very clear when you do active listening and you're in a discovery mode opposed to just trying to validate what you already know, that you start to see those different audiences, you start to see those subgroups, you start to see the different types of topics, and you'll notice that people aren't just talking about the business solution. They're not talking about, a lot of times, unless somebody's forcing them to send out content, they're normally not even talking about the products or services. They're having real conversations with other people that are in their space, whether they happen to be fellow employees, whether they happen to be people they're collaborating with, or clients, vendors, other stakeholders. And so I think that the first most important point is that active listening. Once you get to that point, I think that for a lot of B2B marketers, because there is more complexity, especially for the marketers that do a lot of the social listening work, in my experience, that are kind of coming up in their career, one of the important things is to be able to kind of create the profiles of the different audiences that they see bubbling up. Because we often think, B2B, not B2B to C, and then what are all of the audiences and the stakeholders, and oftentimes just mapping out what those core personas are, including, vendors, employees, and other audiences that sometimes don't already have a profile from like the marketing perspective, can just create a lot of clarity as they start doing the active listening. They can see trends and then map those to the individuals, as well as if they see employee clusters that are engaged with certain audiences, they can activate those people with the audiences that are most interesting to them, opposed to just the brand talking to everybody. So that sort of starts to get into one of the next steps of segmentation. So active listening, mapping your personas and understanding the different stakeholders, and then being able to do sort of more specific segmenting work and having potentially even different messages for different groups to be able to stay relevant in that conversation with them.
I think at that point, really, it's not everyone's talking about you, and it's a tiny percentage of any conversation even is about things to do with your solutions, that you're wanting to talk about. And so really, I think understanding, what are the conversations that are going on out there, and how can we use, a knowledge of those to our best effect. I looked at a really simple perhaps audience of IT managers. We found over 3,000 of them who very quickly self-identified as that. And we actually can have a look at what they've been talking about over the last 24 hours. And this just really, for me, kind of emphasizes this. This is a group of people, some of what they're talking about is IT related, but a lot of it is to do with board games, or as this particular hashtag shows, these guys love cycling. And so what kind of insight can we gain from this broader understanding of what an audience cares about, what they actually talk about in their spare time, how they talk professionally, and how can we use that kind of information, Laura?
Well, this information is extremely valuable. The question is, it depends on which audience you're engaging with and for what outcome. I'll just give some scenarios. So I'm a triathlete myself, and it's interesting because in the early days of Twitter, in 2008 and 2009, I separated my my lifestyle kind of tweets from my personal Twitter. I was like, my business contacts don't care that I'm doing a triathlon this weekend. In fact, my clients might think that I'm distracted and not catching up on work. And that was a mindset. And in some companies, that still is a mindset that when I'm at work, I should only be thinking about work. But we're all human. And oftentimes, the best and easiest ways of starting conversation with people isn't the business conversation, it's something else. And just from a community-minded standpoint, I like to know that information. So when I meet people, if they have a favorite way they take their coffee, or a favorite wine, or activities, or if they have kids, that's all really valuable information. And essentially what you're bubbling up right here is the exact same kind of information that you might have to sit down and have a coffee with every single one of those people to learn that kind of stuff, which to me is extremely valuable. And if you do have in-person relationships as well, it only builds on the knowledge that you have to be able to activate. So, the IT managers that you're showing, essentially, they're not talking about IT all day long, and that's a really valuable insight. And I think that also, whether when I've been in-house or when I'm working with community managers or marketing managers that are in-house and they need to sell this up the chain and bubble it up, being able to have the data that says, hey, that idea of having, a spin class, we're going to sponsor a spin class and invite our customers, or, we want to do something in this space, or we want to write blogs around, these topic areas because that's what people are interested in. That's really valuable information. That content may outperform the stuff that's about your core product. But if you already have a relationship with those people and you're trying to further it, something like the love cycling, that just makes a ton of sense to me to say, okay, if you have a huge population of your customers that have, an active lifestyle, why not try to, connect with them on a more human basis? That will go so much further than, just tweeting with them about, what you're trying to sell. It's just, it's a more human, less selfish way of approaching it.
Yeah, it's more human, I suppose. I suppose with IT managers, a very broad audience here, as well. You might know that people like that like cycling, but what I think is also really exciting is what about IT managers in Ohio who recently talked about our campaign, and going even more granular with this, and then understanding these same kinds of insights and discovering those differences is what really kind of can discover insights that let us plan these kinds of things in an innovative way and in a human way, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's an important aspect there, Nick, which is your customers in Ohio are different than your customers in New York. I have 2 team members right now that aren't based out of New York but are in New York, and they kept me out until almost 1 in the morning because they wanted to experience the New York approach. I thought it was amazing that people were out on a weeknight that late and that all the places were busy. That blew their mind. That that's just not what they're used to. So I think that understanding location and those nuances as well can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. So speaking of celebrities hanging out in New York, the next question is, how important are influencers, really? Should we all be going for the most famous person we can find? Or is there something else that I need to be looking for in the influencers that I reach? And also, I suppose, how effective is it to look for these influencers?
Well, I think those are all fantastic questions, and it's multi-layered. The first thing is that influence is absolutely not about total reach. You're really when you're hooking up with some kind of influencer, it has a lot more to do with what is the connection between that person and your audience, and then how does your brand fit into it? Because somebody like Kim Kardashian is only going to resonate with certain audiences and for certain products, and I think that oftentimes in the desire to get as far ahead as quickly as possible, it's well, let's just get a really big name and have them push for us. Oftentimes what I see is that there's a lot more engagement with people that are up and coming and or people who are just regular people that are very passionate about certain areas. So if you take an approach where you get a group of influencers that each have collectively highly engaged people that are like them or aspire to be like them, and then those people that are underneath the influencers, they know a lot of people that are following them too. You can create a much larger reach and higher engagement when you get influencers that care more and are more connected. Now, for some audiences, Kim may be a great example, but in the B2B space, I don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of a B2B business where that makes tons of sense for her to be the influencer out front.
We looked at a couple of different influencers that might be more specific to a B2B audience, and we basically looked for people talking about SEO, and we took 2 of the most influential. So these guys might both be really, really good targets for a shared content campaign or just to reach out to and ask them to help spread and amplify our messaging. I'm going to ask Benj to explain a little bit about what we're looking at with these two different influencers and how we've got this data and how it works.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that we had this influence graph that we built up by looking at a year of interactions between people on Twitter. And so starting from a particular influencer, we can see who's interacted with them and how are they different to the rest of Twitter, what sets them apart, and start to do some statistics to try to profile, what's specific about their audience. And so you can see that the SEO Smarty is much more specific to SEO. The people who interact with her tend to be also in the SEO field, whereas Barry Pessler has a much broader kind of social marketing audience. And so if you weren't just into SEO, but you wanted to reach a broader range of people, then he might be someone to go for.
So the one on the right, Barry Pessler, it's perhaps people who don't work in SEO but are very strongly affected by it. So people who are inbound marketers or people who are working in strategy. And so, yeah, I mean, this is what we're talking about, right, Lauren? So even though we have two really, really big influencers here, we're going to approach them and we might use them in different ways and on different occasions, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is really about like different influencers have different audiences themselves, and this is a great example of, two people who could be very influential within this space that when each harnessed separately in the appropriate way and engaging with them, they bring different audiences, but they also could contribute to the same conversation. So I think there's definitely, in terms of, from a more tactical perspective, when people are thinking about, I want to use influencers, how do I use them? They need to be thinking about, how is that influencer going to engage? What audience do they reach? Who do they truly influence, and who follows them? And how can you activate them? Like, what is and what might the recruitment behind that be? Or is it just building a more organic relationship with some of those influencers where you're sharing their content, retweeting, favoriting in conversation and building that up, and it's not a forced activity, but it is, you have a list and you're tracking against it, and being able to engage those folks and knowing what you're expecting out of the different networks and the different influencers that you're plugged into.
Yeah, and I suppose if you look at each of these kind of networks, the way that we're visualizing this at least, you have a free study, as it were, on that audience. Because if we have a look at what kind of content these two share, we can see what kinds of things our target audiences are sharing and are talking about and like and care about.
Absolutely. When marketers, especially B2B marketers, say that they don't understand their audiences well enough and that they can't, I mean, this to me is the answer to what seems to be a hurdle in the B2B marketing space, which is there's a lot that we can know. We can't know everything, but this is the beginning of understanding how different influencers use different content and who follows it and how they share it out, and that's all very important and influential to what you do with your content community and marketing initiatives.
Fantastic. We've got another graph here to have a look at. This one is actually based on the followers of our very own influencer, Will McInnes, CMO at Brandwatch. I really like this one because it tells a really, really clear story of a person. So we looked earlier at IBM, didn't we, Benj? And we saw a really, really huge international audience there. But tell us a little bit about what you found out when looking at Will's following as an audience.
Yeah, so Will has a very international following. You have some of these clusters are mostly people located in the US, others for the UK, Germany, Ireland, and there are two down in the bottom right corner here that are located in the UK and one of them in Brighton, where the Brandwatch headquarters is and where Will used to live, and then a community that interacts very strongly with it, which is a kind of UK designer and environmentalist community there.
It's interesting to see how different those UK audiences are to Will's kind of American contacts, which perhaps is more work-related or just in general a different kind of audience that gathers around someone like Will in a place like that.
Yeah, so I think what you see here is that it's not someone's followers aren't a monolithic thing, and you have these different segments that you might need different content in order to cater to.
That's great. Lauren, I want to move on before we run out of time to just ask you our final question, if that's all right, which is perhaps the most important. What do you think success looks like? We can't all be like Elvis and see very clearly when we've been successful with our audience. So what kinds of metrics or what kinds of reactions do you look for as a B2B marketer if you want to understand your success at reaching or growing an audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you think about, what does success look like? And this is the same conversation, whether it's a content and community conversation, whether it's identifying your audience as part of that, or whether you pull the lens even further out and you look at, what does success look like in marketing? The first thing is like understanding, what are the business outcomes the business is trying to achieve? And then how do the different initiatives and the people that we're engaging with, how do they contribute towards those? Because when you can draw more linkage from the first point, it makes it a lot easier to not only define what success could look like, but also to show how this kind of work can make an impact, not just on marketing, but how it can make an impact on the greater business and the outcomes. In terms of how do you bring that to life, like, getting to that success point, I think a lot of it starts with, brands are often good at testing things, but a lot of times what they're good at is validating the things that they know or the things that they think that they know, and they're just trying to prove. And I think one of the most important things that something like, doing more audience discovery work opposed to, validation work can bubble up is seeing the things that you didn't know coming. Like one of the things that we often say from a company standpoint at Perks is we'll say, I'm not as worried about the things that you're trying to validate. What I'm worried about and what should be keeping you up at night, and I'm starting to hear this more and more, is the stuff that you don't even know is coming. So that's where the discovery work really comes into play. It's great to validate that you think that a certain audience is interested in certain topics, and that is a great use of social listening and audience discovery work. But I'm more interested in terms of the greater impact on success, in terms of making sure that you're really keeping an eye on the discovery aspect, because there's so many things that businesses don't know are coming. If you think about Airbnb or you think about Uber, if you talk to, the yellow taxis in New York, or you talk to, Hilton and Marriott, 5 years ago they would have said, no way could a platform like that disrupt our industry or cut into our marketing share. And that market share has changed so much because the competitive landscape is changing and competition is coming from so many different places. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in community in the last 13 years, what has changed is this level of transparency, level of information, and ability for markets to be disrupted even more quickly than ever before, is that doing audience discovery work can give you insight to know what's happening and what's going to happen and seeing those trends. And it's normally not the information people are looking for. They're trying to validate what they think they know, opposed to discovering what's happening with their audiences and what's happening in their competitive overall landscape, not just their direct competitors. I think that that is a huge game-changing element in terms of understanding what success looks like. If you can use audience discovery work to understand where your entire industry and where your business should be going, that's huge value add. And that's not just to the marketing strategy, that's bubbling it all the way up to, what are the products and services that we sell, and, how are we going to market, how are we going to remain competitive, and who are we competing with? And I think that those are just really valuable business questions that work like this can answer.
Yes, I mean, that sounds to me like it's a two-pronged approach, because from the start, it's about being more efficient, right? It's about saying, we know where the valuable audiences are. We know within our existing audience, what those valuable segments are and who we should be talking to within there. We can find employees, we can find influencers, we can find new groups that we didn't know existed. But I think what you're saying is perhaps a little bit less easy to measure, which is it's also about saying, you know what, we discovered that marketing moment that we couldn't have predicted, and we wouldn't have known about that if we weren't really understanding our audience.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely one of the greater qualitative elements. If you talk to a number of the industries that are fighting hard to get some of these new business models like Airbnb and Uber out of their competitive playing field, if they knew that information, several years ago, 5 years ago, they might have just chosen to invest in those companies to be able to, essentially have a foot in both sides of the equation. Like that would be a strategic move that if the audience work was bubbled up to the executive and the board level, like those types of strategic decisions, which are game changing, could be made. And I know that there's so many industries, even if you look at Kodak, you look at, where things have gone with Nokia, there's so many big brands that if they had stayed out front and really gotten deeper into not only knowing their audience and which people they reach, but also knowing their employees and how to not only engage them, but the people that they know and reach, it could make a huge difference on the bottom line. And discovering new opportunities to keep the business relevant and stay ahead of the curve.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I think we have some time to answer some questions, so I'm going to see, we have a few here already. We'll see how many of these we can get through. If you still have any questions, please do get in touch. We can get in touch again via Twitter, or we'll get in touch more directly. Lauren, this one is for you. Do we perhaps run the risk of diluting a brand message if we target by interests? So if we're looking at an audience that has a common interest.
Niche and segmented marketing has worked wonders for decades in lots of different ways. Direct mail was successful in its heyday because it was targeted, it was niche, and they changed the message to different segments. One of the beauties of that I keep bringing up, the idea of leveraging employee networks, is that being able to leverage employees in different groups within the business to engage with specific audiences, it's not diluting the message. It's having the right people in the company engaging with the right external networks. And I think that can make a huge difference. It's not diluting the message, but in today's world, it's the right message to the right audience at the right time. It's not taking the core brand message. Like I have a very strong brand roots. I started as a journalist. So for me, the storytelling aspect is really important. That core brand promise, core brand story, that never goes away. But how that translates and how that gets told to different audiences to make it relevant for them, that is where we need to be more adaptable as marketers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've got another one here that, Benj, I might ask you. So someone's asked for a bit more information on, are we also calculating influencer score using Brandwatch, or are we using other tools? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how we calculate influence and sort of what the key metrics are that make somebody influential in this case?
Sure. Yeah, so when we think about influence at Brandwatch, if you're talking about someone's global influence, where you can compare people in different fields and see who's more influential, that model of influence is something that Brandwatch acquired when it bought Peer Index, which is a London startup that specialized in those sort of metrics. And this influence model takes into account things like followers, the number of posts people have made, how many retweets they got, but also social network analysis of that influence graph that I talked about that's built up from the interactions between people, the retweets and the mentions. And so this influence score does come from Brandwatch, and it's a way of ranking the results by someone's global influence.
And it's updated live, right?
Yeah, that's right. So they're updated with the profile metrics, and we can also look at someone's influence on a specific audience. So this would be finding people who have a disproportionate influence on a group of people who you've identified, which wasn't something we talked about in the webinar, but it's one of the features that's currently in R&D for the audience's product.
And so that would allow us to perhaps find people that don't necessarily have very many followers, a couple of hundred even, but within a very niche group, they might actually be quite a big deal. And a lot of people are listening to what they have to say. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you, Benj. That's really nice to know. Lauren, we'd like to hear a little bit more about the concept of B2B to C. So we touched on that a little bit earlier. I suppose, what kind of approach, perhaps practically, do you think B2B brands are perhaps missing out on without sort of looking at B2B to C as an idea?
Okay, well, let me kind of start answering that by clarifying the ways of looking at B2B to C. So B2B to C, in terms of business to consumer, this is also about industry disruption. So, for example, if you are in the fabrics industry and you sell your interior design fabrics to showrooms and to the pros that do that design work, well, right now that's only a B2B relationship. 3 to 10 years from now, depending on how fast the industry moves, the end customer that you're going to be working with, if you're the fabric manufacturer, is going to be the end consumer. Right now, the end consumer influences the professional, that second B, that the interiors company is selling to. But what's interesting about that is if the company, the interiors company, doesn't build a deeper relationship and influence with the designers that are the pros that are selling to consumers, as well as directly build awareness and relationships with the end consumer, as the market shifts, they're going to put themselves in a real pinch. So that's one way of thinking about B2B to C, is if your industry is in a place where it hasn't already seen disruption, like hotels and transportation and a number of other industries that we could get into, that could be a really, like, the people who are in that community marketing management, brand management role could play a huge, huge role in ensuring the company's future and making sure that all the relationships that are essential to do business today and in the future are there. To get Nick a little bit deeper into the question, in terms of how are we underutilizing B2B to C, I think that example starts to paint the picture of there's influence coming from different places. Consumers, like the end consumer, is influencing the people they buy from even more. So understanding that audience is so important, because often we miss out on that insight. But building the relationship with those influencers that are the second B is also very valuable. Now, something else that we see that comes out of a relationship between the business to business and the business to the end consumer is being able to identify new product ideas, use cases, and areas where there may be a case study. In the B2B world, case studies are huge to being able to show success. So our last section before we got into Q&A was all about what does success look like. Well, between the B2C, which in the B2B world is normally not the place where we focus, there's a massive amount of insight that can influence what we do and what we invest in from a business standpoint.
Thank you. That's really clear and thorough.
If you follow on questions, B2B to C is definitely one area that we're spending a lot more time, not only because I've had a B2C and then went B2B in terms of my own personal background, but because from a community building standpoint, being in the field for so long, we see that trending happening where the relationship web is very mixed and there's lots of interlock, as all of Benj's diagrams showcased earlier.
Thanks, Lauren. We have another question here. Does the process of identifying an audience differ between desktop, tablets, mobile, etc.? Yes, I think it definitely does. I would also suggest that we've just looked really in terms of the data that we're studying today at Twitter, and it would also depend on which of those social networks that you're looking at. Lauren, how have you found brands are trying to distinguish their audiences on different platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I often see is that different audience profiles are either using different platforms or different channels. And so that type of segmented information, just like the earlier question about does segmenting dilute the brand message, absolutely not. It's if we know what that core message is and we always stay on beat with it, but we translate it, If you're talking about mobile, the way that you serve up content has to be different because how people are going to digest it, it's a different size, it's a different framework. So the content and how we serve that up is one thing. How people use that content, how they share it out, and how that's different on mobile or tablet versus desktop, those are trends that really should be influencing our content strategies, as well as if you already have a community engagement strategy, like how do you engage with which audiences, essentially a playbook. Not to pun on the title of my book, but if you have a community playbook and how you actually interact with different audiences, knowing how your audiences behave in different environments, and tablet and mobile versus desktop being one, but also the types of content in the different channels, Twitter versus Instagram versus SlideShare or LinkedIn. All of that is very valuable information to influence the strategic applied to tactical execution.
Absolutely. Lauren Perkins, thank you very much for joining us today, and Benj Pettit as well. Thank you very much, guys, for talking to us a little bit about audiences. We have a few more questions that we didn't manage to get time to go around and answer, but we will follow up with anyone that's asked us a question via email later on. You can find more content on Brandwatch's various different channels, as Lauren was just talking about. We approach our audiences from lots of different angles. Yeah, thank you everyone else for joining us today and for following this webinar. If you have any questions about Brandwatch audiences, of course, please do get in touch. It's going to be released later on this year. Thank you very much, Benj and Lauren.
Thank you.